I'm Jack McCarthy, President and CEO of AppleTree Institute for Education Innovation. Thanks for joining us today for this stimulating conversation. We're recording this discussion and it will be available at www.appletreeinstitute.org. I also believe the Trust for Learning will make this available through their website, www.trustforlearning.org. A special thanks to the Trust for Learning for funding this project. The principles of ideal learning advance core concepts that form the foundation for quality early childhood education, what we refer to as ideal learning. We appreciate their support of this work. Second, thanks to all the school leaders, staff, and experts who brought their time and talent to this work. Bellwether partners, including Ashley LiBetti, Sarah Mead, and Katie Rouse, facilitated the meetings and worked with us to develop this paper. We appreciate the interest, thoughts, and spirit of collaboration from Erin Kupferberg from the staff of the Public Charter Schools Board, also known as the PCSB. We especially appreciate the interest from the new executive director, Dr. Michelle Walker-Davis, who's with us today, and board members who are listening in today. Special thanks to Natasha Perilla, AppleTree's Director of Early Learning Initiatives, for managing this project effectively. So thanks for joining us this morning. Before we go further, please join me in a moment of silence in memory of our dear departed colleague, Jackie Cosentino, co-founder of the National Center for Montessori in the Public Sector, who contributed mightily to this project and who left this world far too early last year. Thank you. Virtually everyone wants greater access to high quality pre-K. As a policy, it polls exceptionally well, and it draws strong bipartisan support, even in these days of deep partisan division. President-elect Biden promises high quality universal pre-K for all 3- and 4-year-olds. He might even get it. That's why our discussion today is so important. Washington, D.C. is really unique. It's the only jurisdiction in America that provides universal pre-K for both 3- and 4-year-olds at per student spending levels higher than any other state-funded program. Pre-K in the nation's capital is provided through a mixed delivery system, including DC public schools, 37 public charter school LEAs, as well as community-based organizations. Public charter schools serve more than half of DC's pre-K students. This combination of DC's robust funding and the autonomy established by the District of Columbia School Reform Act provides an unparalleled opportunity for innovation in service of high-quality early learning for the district students, the majority of whom come from low-income backgrounds. It's often said that beauty's in the eye of the beholder. So too, it seems, is the definition of high-quality pre-K. When it comes to education, we often measure things that are easy to measure and then assign greater meaning to it as a proxy for more important things that are more difficult to measure. That's why quality in much of early childhood education, which as a sector tends to be under-resourced, is usually measured through inputs, which are easier to count than outcomes. Quality in DC's charter schools is measured by the Public Charter School Board's Performance Management Framework, also known as the PMF, which measures attendance, the quality of teacher-child interactions, and the school readiness outcomes that result. Given this, the PCSB plays an important role in overseeing quality of pre-K in the District of Columbia, ensuring that taxpayer investments in pre-K charters result in outcomes for children. The PCSB assesses schools' performance every year. Parents and families often use this score to inform their school choice rankings, and the PCSB uses results from this PMF as a factor in school closure, renewal, and expansion decisions. Given the sway the PMF has over a school's existence, it's crucial that it accurately and comprehensively measures school performance. While DC's experiment in bringing universal pre-K to scale has matured during the past 15 years, the fields of neuroscience and behavioral research in child development have been evolving rapidly. Many quality programs bring a research to practice continuous improvement lens to quality. We can bring that same lens to measurement for accountability. The unique conditions that exist in the District of Columbia today and the desire to bring high-quality pre-K to scale nationally create an important opportunity for the Public Charter School Board, in partnership with charter LEAs providing pre-K and other stakeholders, to innovate in its own approaches to monitoring charter pre-K quality and to develop and demonstrate for the nation even more personalized and play-based approaches to pre-K and early grade measurement that go beyond the typical input and compliance-based approaches that dominate the early childhood field. The charge of the steering committee for this project was to develop a set of concrete recommendations to design an aspirational, actionable, and equitable performance management framework for pre-K that addresses key limitations of the current framework and better reflects a holistic, child-centered measure of early childhood equity. The steering committee's recommendations further aim to support an accountability framework that is useful for everyone, including parents, teachers, and administrators, and is aligned with what schools already measure for their own quality improvement purposes. This is an exciting opportunity to reduce or eliminate the tension between measurement for quality improvement and for program accountability in publicly funded pre-K programs. The steering committee also sees opportunities for more research to practice partnerships to leverage the district's investment in quality pre-K in ways that can benefit the nation. Washington, D.C. is not often considered a leader in public education, but this is an area where the district has led for more than a decade in terms of investment, incentivizing quality programs, and innovation. The vision and work from this project can make a significant contribution to informing the establishment of pre-K frameworks nationally. This is what drives the work, and this was the steering committee's vision for success. Today, we have two panels that will be facilitated by Ashley LiBetti of Bellwether Partners. One involves nationally recognized experts in measurement who participated in our process, and the second involves leaders who are involved with the steering committee and who work to provide high quality pre-K each day to the District of Columbia's children. I'd like to thank Elliot Regenstein, Bridget Hamre, and Kathy Hirsh-Pasek for joining us today on this first panel. And I'd like to turn this over now to Ashley to facilitate. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks, Jack. Good morning, y'all. My name is Ashley LiBetti. I am an associate partner with Bellwether Education Partners. As Jack mentioned, I helped facilitate the steering committee, work through its process, go to the analysis and the findings. So 2 panels that are happening today. Obviously, the first is the one with national level stakeholders. They offer these unique and complementary perspectives on trends in the field overall. I'm gonna have them introduce themselves, or actually I'll introduce them in just a sec. The second panel is with early childhood stakeholders, particularly school leaders in DC. So in that panel, we'll talk about what the field level trends mean in the context of DC schools. For the sake of keeping everyone's Zoom screens straight, I'm gonna have the second panel introduce themselves after the first panel finishes. So, okay, so first is Elliot. Elliot's gonna talk first. He's gonna talk through the theory kind of undergirding early childhood accountability and the intersection of that with K-12 accountability. Second is Bridget. She's going to talk about, she's from Teachstone. She's going to talk about how class is being used for accountability in the current moment, and then how that work aligns with schools' continuous improvement efforts. And then finally, Kathy. She's going to talk through the possibilities for measures of early childhood quality moving forward. So I think that's it from me at this point. I'm going to turn it over to Elliot.
Thank you so much, Ashley. And it's a real honor to be here today with such a great panel. We don't have much time, so let me jump right into it. In thinking about accountability, the most successful organizations are those that have strong internal accountability. Regardless of what anybody else says, they're holding themselves accountable, and AppleTree is like that. But in the context of public funding, there will always be external accountability as well, as there should be. If public money is being spent, it's important that the public have confidence that it's being spent effectively. But that raises the question of what is effectively? What is this accountability for? The nature of external accountability for public funding has looked very different in K-12 and early learning, and in both has evolved over the years. In K-12, for the last couple of decades, it's been heavily focused on the results of standardized assessments. And while you could do a day-long seminar on that issue just in K-12, I think we can all agree that that is not an appropriate approach within early childhood. In early childhood, and Jack alluded to this, historically accountability has been for program design characteristics. If you look at state quality rating systems and the history of the Head Start performance standards, a lot of the accountability is about relatively static characteristics of a program's design. In many instances, a program's rating could be largely set on the day it opens without any regard for the actual experiences of the children in that program. But of course, that child's experience is what matters most for their long-term outcomes. And so coming to a richer understanding of that experience is the key to developing good accountability systems. Accountability systems matter because they drive behavior. And so in designing one, it's important to ask, what behavior is that system driving? This has been a major issue in both K-12 and early childhood, where policymakers have struggled to predict what behavior will actually get driven by their choices. And too often, that has led to tension between what a good internal accountability would look like and what the external accountability looks like. That, to me, is one of the major values of this report, because it talks about what meaningful external accountability should look like in a way that harmonizes with strong internal accountability. In a good internal accountability system in either K-12 or early childhood, you're focused on that great classroom experience. And that's why this report talks about class, which is the leading tool for understanding that experience. I know Bridget will say more about that. The report also raises the important idea of looking at other measures to get a richer sense of the experience in early childhood programs, and notes that we need better measurements. That's an incredibly important point, because accountability systems over the years have had a tendency to make the best of what's around, as Jack said, rather than focused on developing the tools that really fit the job. Think of trying to slice an apple. If you don't have any knives, but you do have a spatula, you're going to try to use that spatula to slice the apple, and it might kind of work, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't go out and find a knife at the first opportunity. That speaks to something else that's really important about accountability systems, which is they need to learn and get better over time. In 5 or 10 years, if we don't know a lot more than we do now, that's a missed opportunity. And that's why the recommendation about ongoing formal assessment is so key. In any policy action, even ones that undeniably make things better overall, there's something that gets missed, something that could have been done better. So ongoing assessment is key to that continuous improvement process. That's also an important frame of mind for the recommendations about how results are reported. There will never be perfect consensus on what should go in a school quality report, but there can be an ongoing effort to learn from its audience about what's the most meaningful information and how families and stakeholders can best learn about how schools are doing. That's a critical form of customer service. So in the ongoing spirit of continuous improvement, I am sure that as my fellow panelists are talking, I will think of all sorts of ways that these comments should have been better. But in order that you may hear their wisdom, I will stop now and just say thank you to all of you for being a part of this event. Thanks to AppleTree for including me, and I look forward to hearing more from my fellow panelists.
Perfect. Thank you, Elliot. I definitely did not come into this conversation expecting to hear the word spatula, but I think that may have just made my day better. Okay, Bridget, let's go to you. I feel like you have good things to add here.
Sure. I will just say it's hard to follow Elliot for a variety of reasons, but mostly I appreciate being made to laugh. Well, first, I just want to thank the AppleTree and other folks who put this together, because so I work at Teachstone. I'm the CEO, co-founder of the organization that's really was built to scale class. And I always say the best thing that we can do is be a spark of innovation. And it really is what's happening in the field that helps us spread that innovation, but also really importantly learn. So I think the work that has happened in DC over the past few years has been very helpful to us. I think we all are aligned around a vision that we want to measure what matters most. And as Jack said, unfortunately, measuring what matters most for young children is not easy. And that is really what I've spent sort of the last 15 years of my life sort of dedicated to. How can we actually measure the essential interactions that we know drive developmental and learning most effectively and efficiently? I think class does remain the best version of our ability to do that, with over 200 studies that document correlations between class and outcomes. But we know we can do better, right? So we can talk some about that. I will say at the highest level, when we think about class and accountability, I often get asked, are you glad that class got put into first the sort of Head Start accountability system and the Curious system? And I can say resoundingly yes. Sorry, I just got muted, but I unmuted myself. Not that there haven't been a lot of challenges with that use, but I'm pretty confident that the kind of changes that we've seen in terms of attention to the quality of interactions in the Head Start system, but also in states across the country, it simply wouldn't have been the same if class solely got used for an improvement tool. So that's the key challenge that I think we're here to talk about today. And I think the report has a lot of great recommendations. It also references the work in Louisiana, which I personally have learned a lot about the use of class from the way it was enacted in Louisiana, because I think they've done an amazing job at sort of threading the needle between an accountability system and an improvement system. And there's a lot more to say about how they did that, and I'm not going to get into the details, but I think a lot of the recommendations that are in this report are aligned with that. Things like making sure there's sort of local buy-in and understanding so that teachers, leaders, coaches really know and understand the tool that they're being assessed on. And unfortunately, we don't see that always happening. There are many teachers who I hear come in and get observed in class without knowing anything about the tool. And that's simply not what we need to see to make meaningful change. I think we've really seen over the past few years the need for leaders, particularly program level leaders, site-based leaders, to truly know and understand the tool in ways that they can use the data most effectively. We've been doing work over the summer and into the fall in Chicago, having virtual coaching sessions with Head Start leaders across the city. And it's really focused on that. And it's the first time many of them say, we've been getting class scores for years, but it's the first time somebody's really come to talk to me about how I use this data to drive meaningful change. So I think I would just really encourage folks to sort of read through the report. There's a lot of good recommendations about how frequently do we need to measure? How do we make the data most useful for our teachers and leaders to really drive improvement? We're working all the time on innovations in that space, but also really deeply indebted. And I'm excited to get to the practice part of this conversation, because I will just call out that they are better experts in this than me. And so the work that's happening at places like AppleTree and BRIA, and in the KIP system, where I got to actually visit a couple of seasons, like eons ago before the pandemic, that's where sort of true innovation is happening. So I will stop there and look forward to more conversation.
Thank you, Bridget. All right, Kathy, ready? Up to you.
I think so. Thanks, everybody. Well, I want to start this by simply congratulating everybody on this call, including AppleTree and the report, and to thank you. But everyone in this call is invested in education. And 2020 has been absolutely the hardest year we have ever had to navigate, ever, when we think about young children and care about young children. So for all the Herculean efforts that have happened in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere, brava to all of you. Could you put the other slide up first, please? Thank you. There are a couple points that have come up that I want to draw attention to before I get to my slides. The first is the issue of accountability versus improvement. And I think in the science of learning, the science of psychology, that's really where we are at right now. How do we talk about the kinds of accountability that will actually lead you to improvements? The second thing that I want to raise right now is accountability of what? We've been talking a lot about, yes, we need the accountability. It should be for improvement. It needs to be ongoing. It needs to be culturally sensitive. But what do we want to measure for? And I think this is a very big issue that we haven't given enough time to. Now, traditionally, we would answer this question by saying it's all about school readiness. And school readiness is important. Reading, writing, math, those kids have to be ready to go when they land at school. And COVID has only made it worse. But the other thing I want to share with you is that when I ask parents, not just tell parents what the school is doing, but ask them, what is your definition of success? They tell me something different. They don't just say school readiness scores on a test. They say we want happy, healthy, thinking, caring children who are social and who become collaborative, creative, competent, and responsible citizens of tomorrow. Notice thinking is in there. It's one of the skills that we want and they want. But I encourage all of us to think about, what do we want from a whole child and a graduate? And to that end, at the Brookings Institution, we've just come up with a new report. And the new report discusses what we are calling a new path to education reform. Playful learning promises 21st century skills in school and beyond. Well, what do we mean by these 21st century skills? We've gone back to scientific papers, really thousands and thousands of them, and tried to distill not what we don't know, and believe me, there's a lot there to continue to do research on, but what do we know? How can we move the needle forward? And I've come up with at least a rubric. It's a start of, we know how kids learn and we know what kids learn. So let's go to how for just a moment. In order for children to learn, especially young children, it has to not be boring. It has to be somewhat engaging, if not fun. It has to be active, not passive. Kids just don't sit there as a lump on a log. And by the way, neither do we. It has to be engaging, not distracting, so it doesn't take you off what you should be learning and then ask you crazy questions. I've seen so much, especially online learning and app learning like this, where they tell a story and break the story to ask you a question. Oh, Harold begins with H. What else begins with H? It should be meaningful to the child and meaningful within the context of the child's culture. And to the best of our ability, we need more discussion in classrooms. We've lost that. Do you know that even when schools were in, we were only having discussions and conversations with our kids 9 to 15% of the time? Wow, language is the single best predictor of later success. Then we move to the what kids need to learn. They need to learn how to get along, to collaborate, to have relationships with us, with parents, and with other people in the world. And that's even going to be more important post-COVID. They need to learn to communicate. And that means listening and strong language skills that will prepare them for literacy. And it means writing skills. They need content. They need to know their STEM and they need to know their language and their reading. Among social studies and science as well. Critical thinking, and yes, even our youngest children can do critical thinking. Creative innovation and confidence. And here you see the how and the what briefly sketched out. And then if we dig in just a little, next slide, please, we can ask, well, how do we know or account for, or how do we measure things like the language that we want them to have? Well, it's not just going to be on bare vocabulary. It's got to be on vocabulary. It's got to be on their ability to use the grammar of the language. And it has to be, for many children, almost 20% in our country, the ability to navigate among more than one language.
Get to it.
Oh, I have one more thing, just to say that our new assessment tool, the Quills, that you can look up, is an attempt to do that as an ongoing information building attempt at building quality once we dig in.
Okay, thank you. Lauren, I think you unmuted maybe to ask a question, but there will actually be time for questions at the end. So I want to start kind of with a more back and forth discussion here. So we've talked a lot about continuous improvement and the importance to align quality and accountability, or continuous improvement and accountability in the context of pushing for quality. But one of the things we've seen recently is that as a result of COVID, early childhood is getting more attention than it has previously. But a lot of the narrative focuses on early childhood as kind of care, as like a place for parents to have children cared for while they work. And that obviously undermines the importance of quality in early childhood programs. So in this current context, how do we use quality improvement, accountability, like the various levers we have accessible to us to continue to push the field to prioritize quality within early childhood? We don't have much time, so don't do that thing where you sit silently.
Yeah, no, I'll be brave and try to go first. So, you know, it's interesting. I think you're absolutely right about how the conversation has played out, and that we've also seen in the K-12 world a huge conversation about learning loss, right? And the sense that kids being out of school has this tremendous loss of educational experience, when in reality, both the care and the experiential loss is happening at all ages, right? And that part of what hopefully we can use accountability systems to do is to help emphasize that the experiential loss for young children, and again, I totally agree with Kathy that like it's not just about what are we learning, it's about the interaction and the conversation and the dynamics, but that is a huge developmental loss that is going to fall most heavily on the kids who are least likely to get that at home, which is going to be the kids whose parents are still working 2 and 3 jobs, and you know, like all the things we know that exacerbate inequality. So, you know, that the care part absolutely matters, but that hopefully some of these systems will help us make the case for the fact that that's not all that matters.
I would add to that. I agree 100%. I think the other piece is, you know, I think, yes, we're talking about it as care. I think there's also just a huge focus on access right now, which is in the birth to 5 space. Not only do we have learning loss, we have loss of the core infrastructure. You know, so building back better legitimately means building back. We have to build new programs because we've just lost a bunch of the industry. So I think that is a huge charge right now. But if we focus only on access without focusing on quality, then we all know those are investments that will not have the outcomes that we want. So I think that ability to demonstrate, I think what QRIS and some of these other systems, when used well, have demonstrated is that we actually can build access and quality simultaneous at very large scale. You look at the maps from Louisiana where they've shown year upon year improvement in interactions while also ensuring that more and more children have access to that system, I think is just one of many examples. So I think access and quality is one thing to just be really thoughtful of. And I really love Kathy's sort of demonstration, because I think we need simple ways of communicating, particularly to policymakers, about what good quality looks like. I think that's one of the challenges we have with class, right? So I think it's an important tool, but it doesn't always translate well to being able to say, here's what quality looks like. So I really appreciate, Kathy, that just metric. It makes it very visible to say this is what quality actually looks like, and it's achievable.
Yeah, I think you really have shown that it's achievable, Bridget, and thank you for raising that. And Elliot, I totally agree with you too. I think the risk that we face right now as we hopefully get near the end of COVID is that we fall back. We fall back on the standard old ways we've tested forever because they're easy and everybody's used to them. And, you know, I hear all the time, I was part of helping to develop the class when we were at the NICHD study. So Bridget, I hear your pain. It's a lot harder to do, and yet it may be the most important thing that we do. So my hope is that we take Bridget's advice and this report seriously, and that we figure out how to redefine a whole child quality, because COVID can be both the disaster that it is and an opportunity for all of us to rise up and really define what we mean and what we know is best for children.
I agree with you. I know that in our own schools, One of the big takeaways from COVID has been concerns about mental health with our youngest learners and teachers, as well as families. I know this poses a special challenge for accountability and measurement. We've been investing heavily in early childhood mental health consultation. We had a presentation on this about a month ago like this. And I just think this underscores the need to continue greater investment in neuroscience and behavioral research, along with language and literacy, numeracy, and social emotional learning. I mean, these are all parts of the whole child and educating the whole child. And increasingly, events are just causing us to deal with all of these things in real and important ways. That's why the world isn't going to be the same when everything comes back together.
Well, this is, Jack, I think this is really one of the problems that accountability systems have ignored is they haven't built capacity, right? Because dealing with the emotional and mental health needs of children, it's easy to measure that and tell someone they're doing a bad job at it. It's much harder to say, wait a minute, like we as funder have responsibility for making this go well, and we're going to work with our providers to help them be successful at it. And so hopefully that will come out of the conversation. I am nervous though, as Kathy said, I was talking to an advocate in one state who said, you know, every time we have a fiscal crisis, we say, this is going to be the time where we build the system back better. And every time we don't, right? The system has been so heavily punished, right? Providers, children, families, everyone has suffered so much. And that we all know that the way things were before wasn't that great either. So to come out of this and just replicate what we did before would be really upsetting. And so again, hopefully some of what we're talking about here today can be built into what that next version looks like.
And I think there's a moment of, I was just going to say, I think there's a moment of opportunity. This isn't true across the board, but a lot of accountability systems have kind of paused. So one of the things that I find interesting is Head Start, who this year is not being held accountable, for example, for their class scores. There are programs who have said, phew, okay, I don't have to pay attention to my interactions there this year, but there are many programs, to Jack, to your point, who have said, what we need to focus on right now is the interactions that are most core to supporting our children around trauma. And what I want to tell the world is that's great. And that will help your class scores, right? Right. So it isn't like the only way to improve class is by focusing on class, but there's so much that we can do to really hone in on interactions and improve them. And I think there are opportunities right now for people to play around with innovating in that space while we have at least a slight pause in some of the sort of higher stakes accountability systems.
And I just want to chime in, Bridget, to say that from my perspective, as a developmental and cognitive psychologist and a person who works in the science and looks at that bridge to practice, relationships, building strong, caring relationships are actually the foundation for everything. If we don't get the interactions right, our kids aren't going to learn. I don't care how much phonics we do. I don't care how much we try to slam in STEM. They are not going to learn it because, as my colleague Pat Kuhl says, we have what you could call a socially gated brain. That is, we learn as human beings through the nature of human to human relationships, period, full stop. So if there's one thing coming out of the gate I would worry about the most, it's that. It's the neuroscience telling us that Bridget is right on.
Well, and all of us who are parents now appreciate that at a deeper level. I can say I have 6-year-old twins and a 13-year-old, and watching them try to learn through a computer has been better emphasis on this fact of the power of interactions than anything else. So
my view on that is that early childhood and computerized online learning are oxymorons.
Okay, so we have about 3 or 4 more minutes left for this conversation, but several of you have talked about this concept of care. Jack, your example of mental health consultation, I'm thinking about the role that we've increasingly asked schools or early childhood programs to play in the context of COVID to look at, I think, what people talk about as Maslow before Bloom, to essentially be custodians in some part of children's emotional health, safety, well-being. What are things that kind of moving forward you would suggest early childhood programs think about in order to, do you think this should continue to be a priority? If so, like how? What are the thoughts?
I think we've got to acknowledge that what we're doing right now is nowhere near enough, and it's just not what we would be doing in normal times. And I really think the things that we're working on are trying to find authentic ways to engage with families. I mean, when you look at what people are experiencing in terms of housing insecurity, food insecurity, economic insecurity, disease, and so forth, trying to connect with people in real, authentic ways so that you can begin to have these relationships where teaching and learning can occur in important ways is something that I don't think everybody's doing well at this point in time, and that we really have to think about coming out of this so that we can begin to rebuild and account for some of these learning losses and get back to something hopefully better than normal.
I think the other thing is, as Kathy was talking, I was thinking in this space is that too often sort of quality rating improvement systems, accountability systems are driven at the program level. And so when we, I think we have to center these systems around educators, right? We need to support the teachers and the leaders in a way that we just haven't. And you sort of see this in some systems where programs aren't even getting the data back that they need to provide meaningful feedback to educators. So I just think, there's a sense that sometimes in my world, class is being done to me as opposed to I am doing class. And I think at the highest level, giving every educator, including family childcare and those who haven't had access to these tools, and really centering our work around educators is just something that's on my mind.
Can I just add one small thing, which is that we shouldn't think of this just as educators, schools, etc. Right now, I think this is a bigger issue that we have to deal with the entire community. Talk about the neighbors, the neighborhoods, what's going on outside of the school. No school. Do you know children only spend 20% of their waking time in school? And that's when they're in full time. We've got to start asking what is happening the other 80% of their waking time.
And I would just add, I doubt that there's an educator, community leader, provider on this call who's like, oh yeah, like early childhood mental health actually isn't and shouldn't be my responsibility, right? Like everybody wants to help with it, but systemically, have they been set up to be successful at that or to fail at that? And that if we in our systems make the choice of, well, we're going to tell people this is their responsibility and act as if it's their responsibility, but pay them nothing and give them no support to do that, that's not a sustainable strategy. And so that's the policy level choice that needs to be made ultimately. And hopefully in this new political environment, that will be at least a conversation we can have.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. I also appreciate everyone sharing great thoughts right on my time limit. So thank you. I want to move now to the second panel. The perspectives from DC school leaders. We have 4 people here. So Tasia Bhegani from Friendship Public Charter Schools. Will you wave? Perfect. We have Chavaughn Brown from AppleTree Institute for Early Learning. Chavaughn, will you wave too? Edmund Han from KIPP DC. And then Lisa Luceno from Bria Public Charter School. Perfect. Okay, so then I want to start thinking about the intersection of accountability, measurement, and what that means for what your school models, your practices, your design choices look like. So how can accountability and measurements better support innovation, changes, things that you want to explore within how you serve students and operate your schools?
I can start. Hey, everybody. Thank you. That's a big question, Ashley. But I think that first, in order to support innovation, we need to be given data that really allows us to be thoughtful about the measurements that are used for accountability purposes. And by thoughtful, I mean deeply considering the people that represent the data, the recipients of the data, the teachers, the students, the parents, the community, and then how do we use that data to become more innovative. So for instance, for students, do we change the environment? Do we change the schedule? Do we completely rethink what is taught and how things are taught? So we think about class, we think about, let's say, instructional support, and we love that. And the interactions are wonderful, and it's deeply rooted in deep concepts, language, and creating. So should we be innovative by rethinking the manner in which we do school? How does that look? Are we brave enough to be that innovative? So we need the data to support the direction of the innovation, but it needs to be very thorough. I feel like there was a second part to the question, but maybe I'll wait.
Yeah, I think thorough is a great word. And I think I speak for my colleagues and myself that we haven't necessarily experienced limitations in our ability to implement play-based or progressive education from the tools themselves, but it's important to think about how we use them. So just considering, and I recognize that my experience may be limited and other school leaders may have had different experiences, but it's not necessarily the tools themselves, but how they're used. And I think it behooves the entire education community of DC to really stay at the forefront of neuroscience has already been mentioned, and it was mentioned in the report, and to ensure that the accountability systems maximize our impact and the way we're supporting children and also adult learning. It was also mentioned earlier today that it's not just the children that learn in these hands-on ways, right? But it's adults. And so how can our accountability systems support that? Bringing neuroscience to the forefront, incentivizing innovation, sharing, bolstering partnerships, right? Where do we get our inspiration from? From Project Zero, from all these different philosophies that undergird our programs, right? So how can we incentivize that and really put adult learning at the forefront and best support teachers using, as you mentioned, as my colleague mentioned, thorough data that we can use in our schools to drive this continuous self-improvement.
Lisa, I think that's right, but I think there's also a point to be made around how useful is a standard score, or how useful is, percent correct on a normed assessment for our adult learners. And I think a piece of what we've done better over the last couple of years, and why I appreciate the thought partnership of the Public Charter School Board, is to make those data actionable so that we can innovate and hopefully layer accountability to, that I know we all feel, to our families, our children, our teachers, but also to teaching and learning, so that the accountability data collection is layered with teaching and learning in a way that's not just one more thing, but something that is actionable, and that teachers get that information. They say, awesome, I know what to do with my class tomorrow, next week, and I know where we're going, and I know the individual roadmap for every student.
I'll quickly jump in and say, building on top of this, and maybe even taking a slight step backwards in perspective, is I would also focus on the mindset behind these accountability systems. I think a lot of times, this is stating the obvious, I think, and everyone here knows this, but accountability systems often take a role of holding programs to task or ranking them. And I think it's both an easy and a hard shift to think about it more in this mindset of supporting innovation. How do you do that? It's where the bottom line is not scoring a program or holding them compliant to certain requirements, or trying to provide a number to allow parents to rank programs more easily, but rather to provide information, to base it on some sort of philosophy on what early childhood education can mean, and be flexible to all the different ways that that can be answered. Because different schools provide different programs, different families want different programs, different kids will respond to different programs. So how do we allow for that in a system that is driven from top down? Some of it's unavoidable because there's a reason and a history behind accountability systems, but I think there's a chance now that, as someone mentioned, we've paused and we're really starting to look again at something like the Aussie Stars or the PCSB PMF. There's a chance here to really rethink that. And I think particularly for early childhood, to realign ourselves around what is the purpose of these things. It's not for the adults to make decisions, or not for the adults to make gains, but rather for adults to make decisions to help the students that are in those schools.
And I think addressing how families are a part of that, right? I know we talked about it in in our working group that families have a voice in this, and families have an idea of what they expect their child to learn in their pre-K 3 or pre-K 4 year, and that voice should also be a part of how schools hold themselves accountable. And so that's something I know, given the amazing circumstances that we're all still trying to navigate, families are at the center of this. And I really do hope that's something that we all take from these unusual circumstances this school year, is how we can incorporate that voice to a more inclusive representation of what accountability looks like, not just at kind of like a state or district level, but also for families and our commitment to serve our communities.
Anything else to add there? Okay, perfect. So I want to start thinking about, I mean, you've all mentioned, and we've heard about this over and over again, the mindsets behind how we use accountability, continuous improvement, things that are driven from the school and things that are driven externally. If you think about like the various functions that, in your case, authorizers and OSSI serve or using measurement, right? Like on one hand, we have for accountability purposes. On the other, we also have for continuous improvement. But then there's also this function that's kind of somewhere in the middle, PCSB or OSSI as a supportive kind of thought partner. Like, to what degree do you think it's appropriate or you would want OSSI, PCSB to serve like each of those functions? Would it be like, where would you fall? What would your personal preference be?
Ashley, you know I have an opinion on this, but I'll pause and wait for the other panelists.
That's a boy. That is a great hard question. I will say this. I think the answer to that really depends on where your network or your LEA is in terms of its development and growth and lifespan, and how far you've gone with this, right? I think they can play a really important role in bringing together great voices, the thinking. They have resources, they have accessibility, they have a not a stick, but they have a way of getting people together. I think though, there's a way for that to go too far. If I'm understanding your question correctly, Ashley, I think there's a way for that to go too far. And I think that's the interesting line. And as long as if there's a way to, I don't know, there are places where that kind of gets sometimes in the way of what we want to do, and takes up time that we can be spending in other ways. And I think allowing for the flexibility for that is where their role is. And so unfortunately, I think my answer is there's no easy answer to that. It really depends on where the particular networks and LEAs are in their span.
I have to agree with Edmund. That is a loaded question. And I think all I would say is I'd be very interested in discussing it.
Yeah, the moment. You don't want to do this publicly? Sorry, Lisa, go ahead.
I'm not positive that I'm understanding all of the things behind the question, but I think, they do provide thought partnership on a variety of topics, right? So if we're talking about being able to take the most salient issues that schools are grappling with and provide us with forums to be able to grapple with those things together, like the English Learner Group or the various things that were provided during the pandemic, during the spring and summer, bringing schools together to share best practices around all sorts of COVID-related topics. That's one thing, right? So it kind of depends on what we're talking about, but I think there already is thought partnership around the most salient issues that the schools are dealing with, and that should continue.
Lisa, I so agree with that. And I think something that is easy for us to take for granted in DC is that we can call up OSSI, we can call up the Public Charter School Board, and they answer our calls, and they want our ideas, they want to include our perspectives, and they want to listen to our experiences. I think both groups are challenged in holding everything to be true to make decisions, but as I've traveled to New York and Texas and Cleveland, Ohio, you don't have that accessibility in these other jurisdictions, which I think actually really does get back to Jack's opening points that we live in a really innovative space where, of course, we all have ideas and we're all innovators and we want the best for the communities we serve, but it's easy to forget that that's not always true. I mean, in these other places that we're trying to bring quality. And so DC really is on the forefront of this innovation, and I'm really grateful to be a part of it.
Okay, anything else to add there? Okay. So I want to go back to this Maslow before Bloom question that we talked about in the first panel. So again, over this past year, expectations for schools, both in terms of performance and responsibilities that we ask early childhood programs to take on, have drastically changed. Like, what has that meant as a practical matter for how you've shifted and how you invest your time, resources, attention, limited capacity? And I guess to that end, like, should accountability play a role in incentivizing schools to take on those responsibilities, whether that's during a pandemic or after?
I think accountability is always going to play some sort of a role. And it's true. I think we've all had to recreate our schools. So yes, it's been a major shift and a recreation of sorts. And so how is it that schools are fulfilling their mission, right, of educating? How are we fulfilling the mission of educating young children and families? How are we innovating to do this? That is something that should be addressed and honored. And when we talk about recreating schools, it's not only virtual learning, right? But how are we providing basic level services? We know in our case, the fact that we had the relationships with the families being a 2-generation program certainly optimized the ability to do that pivot. And we need to look at things like not just the literacy and numeracy, but all of the wellness aspects that are so critical in this time. And so thinking about initiatives that reach the whole family and meet people where they are, providing basic services as well as the higher level aspects of education. And we've all had to take on these additional responsibilities. And so I think thinking about how do we really fortify and support the adults during this time is key. And I think accountability plays some role within that, but I'm not talking about assigning points per se. Yeah.
I would say that for us at Friendship, we have been and we continue to shift heavily toward the Reggio-inspired philosophy. And so we're moving a large majority of our classrooms in that direction because Reggio-inspired teaching and learning sees students as strong and capable. It sees learning as something that should be full of joy, exploration, deeply rooted in relationships, tons of creativity. And something that's really vital and sometimes is forgotten is dignity. You got to treat everyone with the level of dignity. And so whenever there are public funds involved, obviously we have to be accountable. But I don't know how clean and perfect accountability to a Reggio program could look, but we could discuss it. And so for us, like, not only do we want to have that conversation, we're also considering and thinking about how much our students speak, how much do they explain, how inquisitive are they, how creative are they. We've begun to explore executive function as a measure of success, or at least a predictor for later successes. And we've been studying the impact of math as a predictor for later success. So we've begun the shift, and I would say the pandemic has maybe deepened our progress toward that shift. And I think we'd be open to be accountable to running a high quality program.
Yeah, I think we're starting to become accountable in new ways, right? So many children right now are learning on the screen. And one thing that you mentioned, Reggio, we're deep within the realms of outdoor learning right now. And that's something we haven't thought about, accountability and outdoor learning together, right? But things have to shift and change. And let's imagine, you know, after this pandemic, if all children are spending more time outdoors, what is that going to do for our city and experiential learning and place-based education? So there's all sorts of new directions that this has taken us in. And I think it's important that we are accountable for these things.
Ashley, I just want to lift up that I think when we were planning this conversation, accountability felt very different. It felt as something else that was a part of what we do. But Jack, who is on the call, our president and CEO at AppleTree, reminds us every day that our accountability in this moment, and I hope moving forward, is really the families that we serve. And so when we're calling families and engaging in what their child is learning, either through synchronous or asynchronous instruction, the first thing we ask is, how are you? How are you doing? How can we help? And I think that's something that we feel very accountable to, making sure that the families who we serve are cared for and are communicated with and know they matter and that they're a part of our community. Do I think that should be a part of the PMF? Probably not. But I think it's something that as educators, it's our responsibility. And it's certainly something that's been a priority for us. And I know in the other schools that we support across the city and nation that it's something that's very top of mind.
I think there's an issue being somewhat confounded here. So I just wanted to chime in if I could. On the one hand, the issue is accountability. I don't think anyone on this call is against accountability. We all need to know that the child is making improvements. But the question is accountability of what? And until we are clear what we mean by success, and what I mean by success here is, if you were to tell me what you want a child to look like when they exit your school, or when they exit an elementary school, or when they exit your high schools, what should they look like? Then we can work backwards and say, okay, how do I measure that? The science has some clues here, but I think we aren't clear yet as to the what. And so often we take our direction from people who have nothing to do with education, and that's why we've ended up in this bind.
That's a good point to end on. That's actually, the steering committee started with that vision, worked together to try to help define what the child should look like at the end of the program. And that's a lot of how that informs the content of the analysis itself. Okay, so I want to do a quick lightning round. One of the things we actually have touched on, but not explicitly at this point, is equity. So each of the panelists answer, with it under a minute, these two kind of big but also small questions. First, what is your top concern with equity in early childhood accountability measurement? And then two, what is one thing that you would recommend policymakers, authorizers, school leaders to do to make early childhood accountability and measurement more equitable? So I'm gonna go clockwise. I'll name y'all. Edmund, let's start with you.
Great. So I will say my biggest concern, there are many. So I'll take a stab at one, which is I'm worried that certain corners are being cut just so that we can have something to measure. What is the easiest thing to measure? What is available to measure? What's out there to be measured? What's quantifiable so that we can come up with some sort of scale? I think decisions that are made based on that priority feel like they lead to greater inequities. And lead to certain metrics that are laden with biases as a result of how we collect and think about those data points. If I'm going to think about a recommendation, then again, many, but I think it's really important to think about where, by whom, through what process, what input are we getting from schools, parents, prospective parents, parents of older kids, on what is important for ECE, and to build and come up with a model that honors and respects and takes into account the differing philosophies behind ECE in particular. And so the flexibility that can be in those systems would be great to incorporate into a system like this. But there's much more behind that than we have time to talk about.
Tasia?
Okay. 1 minute. I think something that concerns me is where and how bias shows up in any tool that is used for accountability purposes. I feel strongly that it's our responsibility to question the tools, the context of the tool's creation, the methodology of use, and the language and the impact of the potential data. That's a lot. In a recommendation, maybe we need to shift who the policy makers are sometimes, some places.
Lisa?
It's challenging to name just one. I have various concerns. One being the gaps that are only growing and being exacerbated by this lack of in-person learning opportunities, as well as gaps between the childcare sector and the public education space, and what I see as a growing divide among those two parts, critical parts of our system, of our whole system. I think recommendations could include incentivizing innovations for out-of-the-box strategies that are really prioritizing services for the most vulnerable children, as well as thinking about investing resources in the best use of the tools for historically underserved populations. There are resources, and so we need to invest them in that area.
Jack?
Yeah, I agree with most of what everyone has said, but going back to what Kathy said, I think if we can get agreement on what a child should look like when they leave our schools, where we can define what success is, then I think the big challenge is everything we should be doing should be moving more toward personalization, so that we can start with children where they are and look at them as really the unit of improvement versus the school or the teacher or the district. I think the more that we can bring all of these different things together in ways that I think are powerful force multipliers for development and learning, the closer we're going to get to something that is more equitable.
Bridget?
Well, I'll start by just saying I sort of centered myself every day with something that a colleague and friend, Veronica Fernandez, said to me earlier this year, which was, she said it in a large public forum, but she said, you know, the class calls out scoring for the average child. But there is no average child, there's only every child. And I say that to myself every day because I think there's many ways we have opportunity to recenter ourselves around the every child and the every educator in ways that can have impact. And there's lots of ways to do that. But I think, you know, just here we see this great representation of a different kind of diversity. If you walk in, and I have, to KIPP, to AppleTree, to Friendship, to BRIA, these are very different programs run with different philosophy, but at some level you found some commonality around the class. It's never perfect, but there's some. So how can we build on some of those commonalities, but also do a better job in tools like class to represent the diversity of what that looks like? And that also means diversity in relation to dual language learning practices and family childcare and special education. So, you know, and real focus on equity in the classroom. We shouldn't be scoring high if we see examples of racist behaviors happening in classrooms. So I think those are the things that, as a leader of Teach Zone and thinking about class, that we're really centered on.
Thank you. Elliot, second to last, penultimate.
Yeah, so I first of all want to say that my comments are not about DC in particular, they're more broadly, since I have much less experience with DC than many other people on this presentation. But I think the comments about the tools have been great, but my biggest concern is that whatever tools we have, that somehow, again, as I said earlier, we're going to find a way to blame the victims, as it were, and expect activity at the program, teacher, family level that we have not built capacity for. So if I'm thinking about what advice I would give to policymakers, which is what I try to do, it would be think about what is your role in making this system work well. Think about what everybody else's role is too, and try to set up a system where the expectations are directionally correct and that everybody has an appropriate level of capacity to play the role they're expected to in the system, and you only hold them accountable for what you reasonably can expect of them, not for your dream aspiration that's disconnected from the level of resources.
Kathy, let's end with you.
Okay, sure. I guess I have two real concerns on equity. One is I think we don't hear the parents enough, and we're not culturally sensitive enough. So that would be, I think, number one. Number two is we really have to help people have the time and ability to build relationships and to be able to grow things like their language scores, strong, rich communication skills through those language scores. And that's, I think, the biggest barrier to later equity, which then brings me to my policy. What my advice to policymakers would be twofold. One, don't ever use the word literacy without saying language. Say language and literacy, but don't put in literacy and expect kids to get it if they don't have the strong language skills. Finally, think about the community outside the classroom as part of the classroom. Education isn't confined to school anymore. So how do we use it better?
Great. So we have time for audience Q&A at this point. Chavaughn, I think you have the Zoom permissions. Do you want to, I don't know if people need permission to talk right now, but if there are questions from the audience, would love to hear them at this point.
I think everyone can ask. They just have to unmute, and I'm removing the spotlight so we can chat as a community here. Turns out Zoom is not my expertise.
Okay. I mean, while we wait for audience participation, I'm gonna add in a question that I want to know. So I've asked a lot of questions based on what I came in here thinking I needed to know, but what haven't I asked? What do the participants on this call, what does the field need to know about outcomes, assessment, accountability, early childhood quality generally, things that we need to think about moving forward?
So Ashley, I have some ideas on that. I think that a couple years ago, maybe in the not too distant past, we were asked to prove why the pre-K3 and pre-K4 years matter from an early education perspective. And now I find that we're in a position where we have to prove that things like the principles of ideal learning matter, that we have to prove that 3- and 4-year-olds learn best through play and relationships and diverse experiences, and that instruction is differentiated and individualized. And I think an opportunity here, especially in DC, where we have such robust models of early childhood education and funding, is to really lean in a little bit to some of the research opportunities and the questions that we could answer if we were able to bring some of these data sources together. So if the pre-K data from the Public Charter School Board spoke to the data in K-12 with OSSE, we would be able to answer so many different questions, especially since we have so many different data points, not only around child outcomes, but attendance, class scores. We would really be able to tell the story in a different way. So I think there's just something to be said for the opportunity here to answer some of these hard questions.
Ashley, I really want to pick up on what Chavaughn was just saying, because my question would be about what happens next, what happens after early childhood. I think a lot of the concepts we've talked about, particularly about the kind of child experience and mental health support that it really matters. I don't think there's anyone here who thinks, oh yeah, and then after the kid turns 5, none of that matters anymore, right? So the question of how does the accountability for what goes on in the early childhood years relate to the accountability for schools, particularly in the early elementary years, so that there's a continuity of experience, and that, again, it's not just about kindergarten readiness, it's about the child experience for each child as they go through the continuum that continues into kindergarten, first, second, third grade. And how do we make sure that we're not scratching and clawing to create an early childhood system that has the right incentives and that provides the right supports, only for that kid to end up in a K-12 system that's not providing any of that? Because, again, the research, to me, my understanding of the research is pretty clear that no matter what you do in early childhood, if the experiences thereafter aren't good enough, that in the long run, it's going to wear off, right? And so we've got an obligation not only to do the best we can with the kids before they enter kindergarten, but to see that the concepts that matter to us are embedded in systems that go beyond that.
There's a great, it's interesting because I think people in the early childhood world often think if only K-12 educators would listen to us, we have so much to teach them. And I think we all agree to that generally. But I actually have some optimism there. I think, again, not to, like, you'd think I was born and raised in Louisiana, I was not, but they've been piloting class in their K-2 system. And what's interesting about that as an accountability tool, what's interesting about that is it was very much a bottom-up push. It was school principals going through the class training and saying, oh, I see what a critical tool this was, and essentially asking the state that, like, saying this is a better accountability tool for us in K-1-2 than is the sort of direct assessment of child outcomes. So I say that is just one example, but I do think there is an opportunity in this space, especially in the sort of pre-K to 3 space, for us to transform what that whole time looks like. And if we don't do that, then all of these investments, as we know, are ultimately not going to pay off in the ways we want them to.
Well, Bridget, I'm sorry, I was just going to follow that. Like, K-2 is a completely orphaned space in K-12 accountability, right? And even if there's not an opportunity to change, I mean, again, federal law dictates a lot of what happens in accountability, 3rd grade and up, but that K-2 space sort of could be, you could account for it in some way in K-12 accountability, but by and large, places do not. And that's starting to have that conversation, starting to think about, even if you go outside your ESSA mandated accountability, can you use class? Can you improve the way you're thinking about the experience in those years? Like, I agree with you. I think that's a conversation a lot of people in K-12 would like to have, but they haven't been pushed to have it, and they're not always sure how. So the question of how we can help that process along, I think, is really important to think about.
I just wanted to say 2 things. What does happen early in the pre-K actually has pretty strong predictability about what these kids are going to look like in 5th grade. So we can ruin it, but at least the data seem to show that there is that continuity. Secondly, Bridget, I'm seeing the same thing in playful learning. It is starting to move up, at least into K-2. So we're starting to see laws and policy around that. But I think you brought up a really, really important point that Chavaughn noted too, and I just wanted to not lose it in the conversation. And that is that maybe we need to start thinking about learning profiles as opposed to learning outcomes. One of the problems with our accountability measures is that they don't allow us to look at profiles. And, so you get the score, so that's who you are. And I think pulling together all the data from various sources and really getting an understanding of who these kids are, that should happen really all the way through, because that will help all kids get the support they need to create the profiles of learning to generate the success we want to see.
Other responses, particularly from DC school leaders? I think your perspective here would be particularly helpful.
It's playing out a little bit in the chat here, Ashley, with folks talking about how early childhood actually goes through 3rd grade. So I don't know if anyone would like to speak to that.
Yeah, I'll speak from a KIPP DC perspective. I think what I'm going to say is very similar to what we've already heard from a lot of folks here. But if we're going back to the question of concern, and this, I think it ties into this. Unfortunately, I think we're in a rut when it comes to accountability, and we're in, and I'm worried about the historical precedence of the kind of rut we're in, and the pendulum swings we see between really quantified accountability that's really strict and right after a nation at risk, versus the swing back to a more relaxed view on how school should be, then a disfavorement of that over time, because they're not getting the results that they need, to swing back to a more quantitative perspective on this, which then goes back and forth. And so I'm worried that we're reliving that pendulum swing. And so the question to me again is how to break that out, and how to break out of that. I hadn't really thought more fully about the connection from EC on up to K-12, because right now, as everyone's saying, the K-12 accountability space, particularly 312, which is not coincidentally where Park starts here in DC, is just it gamifies things, and it's about ranking schools, and it's about coming up with a score and a star and a rating and a tier, and using that to really punish schools in many ways, and unfortunately, as a result, punish the students that attend those schools as they get close. So I think I'm glad that people are talking about how this links into the larger conversation, that it's not just an early childhood thing, that it actually is an early childhood on up to elementary, on up to middle and high. And I don't have the answer, unfortunately. I think it's the people on this panel who have the answer on how to start expanding the conversation and getting to the people where it makes a difference. A lot of times it feels like we're hitting our heads against the walls when we try to change things, and we run up against federal policy every time. And OSSE, I'm not blaming OSSE for this, but anytime OSSE is trying to change something about how Park is being administered this year, it's unchangeable because it comes down from the federal agencies. So it's difficult, and I'm glad that we're talking about it, because that's the first step. But that's where my head often is.
I'd love to bring another voice to this conversation who has a different perspective, but is deeply committed to quality. Jack, you'll recognize Miss Valerie Carroll from Douglas Knoll. She's in her virtual classroom, I believe, right now. Is an avid believer of high quality interactions. Bridget, she loves class and has attended many professional developments on her own time to expand her understanding and practice, because she's with children every day. So Ms. Carroll, I would love to bring you to this conversation and would love to hear your perspective.
Thank you. As I listen to all of you discuss accountability, and yes, it is definitely needed. But my biggest thing for me as an educator of early childhood is that the definition of early childhood always gets lost. And we focus on our pre-K 3 and our pre-K 4, and we forget about the fact that, as one person said, what happens after they leave pre-K and they go into kindergarten? Well, kindergarten still is early childhood. First grade is early childhood, second and third. And a lot of times we get so hung up as educators and in instruction on the college level that we forget about the early childhood part. And it comes down to, is early childhood just childcare, which a lot of people will look at it and say, oh, that's just childcare, and leave it at that. And then you have the other side that says that education starts at the infancy level, and it goes on and it grows from there. And what we do as educators determines where it goes. How we look at our children, it's just like you said, it's not the average child, it's every child. And if it's every child, then you have to look at the National Association of Education of Young Children and Education of Childhood International, and all these institutions that try to focus on the whole child. And focusing on the whole child is, you just can't limit it to pre-K and K3 and K4. It has to go on. And when they get to kindergarten, they're still learning. And there, in my head, I'm hearing all these things going on in Bloom's Maslow versus Bloom's taxonomy. If with Maslow, your children are not going to learn if they don't have that Maslow first. They gotta have that. Their needs have to be met. If you do not meet their needs, they're not gonna learn. All this stuff that you try to do with them, they're not gonna learn. And then when you look at the children that we work with on a daily basis and the families that we work with on a daily basis, you have to consider what is going on in their families and what they prioritize. Because sometimes education doesn't come first because there's a need to eat. There's a need for shelter, all these things that they're considering. And yes, we know that education is important, but right now for the families, especially right now during COVID, we're trying to survive by just getting food on the table and making sure that our kids have what they need. And for me as an educator, it's all about the child. And as I tell folks all the time, I'm sorry about how you feel, but it's about the child. And how is that child going to learn? And what is this child going to need to learn? So you have to reach out to the families and say, okay, what is it that you are looking for your child? What is it that you want your child to have when they leave? And as everyone says, what do you want them to have as they leave? It is about the what, but then how are you going to do it? What are you going to do to get it done? How's it going to get done? I'm a teacher. I've been in administration, but I prefer being a teacher because you're right there in the trenches. And as I say, Bridget, class is an excellent tool. And all teachers need to be educated on it and learn what it's about, because it helps you to develop and be able to recognize how you should be interacting with those children with whom you teach.
Thank you so much, Ms. Carroll.
I appreciate Valerie, those perspectives. And it's going to make me say something that counteracts something I said before. So I said at the beginning that I was happy that class got used as accountability. I don't know happy is the right word. I think it's been impactful. There are examples of places that have used class that are not a part of an accountability system and transformed. The best of those I would call out is Dallas ISD. They use class pre-K to 2. And I think of it because Valerie, as you were describing, Ms. Carroll, you were describing quality. I toured schools there, and entire pre-K to 3 schools where there's not a single desk, right? Where you walk in and the sort of centering around the child's experience. And I think the kinds of playful learning that Kathy is describing are in evidence really from, they had infant toddler classrooms all the way up through 3rd grade. So I think there is a vision, but it takes whether there's an accountability system or not, it takes sort of vision at the leadership level and then real commitment at the program level. And I think that's what I hear there's so much opportunity for in DC with all the sort of strong program leadership that sits.
I think you're raising a really important point. And the question is how we change the mindset. Part of it is that we have administrators who keep pounding us on accountability scores that are narrowly construed so that it misses out on what's important. And the second is if you could do what class, I think, has done by using class or by using a playful learning rubric of the sort that I presented. What it does is it helps parents, teachers, and policymakers understand that this aspect is important. And otherwise, it's just left, on the side of the road as roadkill as they go along and get their single, narrowly minded accountability scores. So I think the other reason for thinking more broadly about accountability, as Bridget is talking about and thinking about the profiles, is mindset change.
I think it's, again, hard for me to narrow it down to 2 questions, right? Questions that we're not currently asking. But one that's been brought up by Kathy and also by, I think, by others is, well, and by Ms. Carroll recently, is parents again. So how can we then center parents' voice to inform the PMF, right? And thinking about the graduate profile and what it is that parents are wanting and what it is that they value. So how can we actively seek that voice through time and space and resources and validation? And then another question I have is another question I think we need to address is teacher retention. How can we keep teachers like Ms. Carroll, who chose this radical move to continue to be a teacher rather than an administrator, particularly in the midst of this global pandemic when this profession is harder than ever? How can we keep those best teachers and have the accountability system support that? I think I alluded earlier to resources that really show how these tools can be used in transformational ways, not punitive ways. And so I think thinking about how to keep the best early childhood teachers in the field, even in this difficult crisis.
Thank you. That's actually a great point to end on. We just have a few minutes left, so I'm going to pass it to Jack to close us out.
Thanks so much, Ashley. I believe we can all agree that there's a powerful, important, and timely call to action to continue this work and to use this opportunity to bring a research to practice, continuous improvement, and equity lens to measurement for accountability by creating opportunities to pilot new measurement tools and improved measurement approaches to ensure ideal learning programs can be advanced within a publicly funded accountability framework. Through the course of this work, the steering committee constantly drove toward one vision for success: to develop a set of concrete recommendations that could be used to design an aspirational, actionable, and equitable performance management framework for pre-K that addresses key limitations of the current frameworks and better represents a holistic, child-centered measure of early childhood quality. The short and midterm recommendations discussed in our report, which I encourage everyone to download and read, it is in the chat, are all in service of that goal and are intended to help the public charter school board, the DC charter sector, and the broader field move toward it. We recognize that these recommendations are neither exhaustive nor static. New information, tools, data, and circumstances will certainly arise that render certain recommendations ineffective, or perhaps that suggest that additional recommendations are necessary. Given that, the steering committee defined a long-term vision for an early childhood performance management framework that should guide both short and longer-term recommendations moving forward. Specifically in the long term, the steering committee envisions an early childhood PMF that provides valid and reliable information for choice, accountability, and school improvement in a way that's accessible and usable for parents, teachers, schools, and other stakeholders. That's multidimensional and incorporates quantitative and qualitative data. That's correlated with long-term student success, that rewards schools that serve non-traditional or high-need student populations effectively, that supports multiple school models and innovation, that's informed by the latest child development research, and has high buy-in and support from across the sector. Designing an early childhood performance management framework that accomplishes this long-term vision and ensures that all children receive the best possible education will require continued commitment and intentional collaboration from across the sector and with those in government who fund and expect quality early learning in the district and nationally. The work of the steering committee is a thoughtful beginning of this important conversation. We can't let this be the end. I want to thank everybody, once again, our panelists, our funding partners, and all of those who have been watching us together today for participating. Please download our paper and let us know what you think. Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.